Hi, hello everyone. I'm Ana Maria Carneiro, research at the Center for Public Policy Studies at Unicamp, and it's my pleasure to launch the 2022 Lab GEOPI webinars. The Laboratory of Studies on Organization of Research and Innovation was set up in 1995 and is dedicated to carry out studies on and consulting on strategic planning, evaluation, and future studies. This year, we'll have a webinar each month until December. The webinars will take place on the first Friday of each month, except in October, when it will happen on a Thursday. Our events will be at this time. Today, we are thrilled to receive two professors from Europe. Merle Jacob is a professor at Lund University in Sweden, the director of Third Circle Studies at the Department of Business Administration, and professor of research policy. Her research interests are research policy, funding instruments, research evaluation, university-industry collaboration, and corporate research policy. We are also receiving Vuokko Kohtamaki. It's a member of the higher education group at the Tampere University, Faculty of Management and Business at Finland. She is an academic leader of the National Higher Education Expert Training Program, Higher Education Management and Administration. Her research interests are in autonomy, governance, leadership, and management of higher education institutions. First, Merle will present her thoughts on some performance funding instruments and a few general remarks about performance-based funding, showing the heterogeneity of performance-based funding. In the sequence, Vuokko will talk about performance governance ecology of Finnish higher education institutions, showing the performance agreements and performance-based funding. So, Merle, the mic is yours. Merle, your mic is closed.
Is my presentation in presentation mode here? Can you see it in presentation mode? On your
no,
end?
it's on the edition.
I have to start again as usual. This is a kink in Zoom that I have not been able to. Is it right now?
Yeah, it's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, it's a pleasure to be here with you. I think that this is one of the unexpected benefits of the pandemic, that we are actually now using these technologies in ways that we didn't before. It's also a pleasure to be able to share with you some of my work and to talk about performance-based funding. My basic idea here is to sort of present a more general presentation about the diversity of performance-based funding and to take questions later on. It is a very complex world, and much more so than people think, but it can be quite interesting for both researchers and funders to dig a little bit deeper in it. So without further ado, I'll try to see if I can get these slides to move on. Okay, I thought we could start with a quick definition and a history about performance-based funding. Basically, performance-based funding is all funding that is coupled to predefined indicators. So it's any funding that you have to, that there is an agreement in which, in order to get the funding, you have to perform particular specified tasks. And the overall objective of performance-based funding is a kind of hands-on governance of research. So rather than simply govern research in a way that you put in money and then you get out a product, performance-based funding is intended to be much more hands-on and direct steering of research than the usual funding of institutions. Historically, performance-based funding has been used as a complement to institutional or block funding. And when I say institutional or block funding, I mean money that is given directly to universities or public funding or public research institutes that is intended to pay for staff and all their activities, but it's not based on a calculation of their performance on any particular indicator. Normally, performance-based funding historically was basically only directed to individual researchers or research teams. So it was not an institutional funding modality. Prior to the 1990s, even publicly funded universities in Europe did not use very much performance-based funding. They were mainly funded as organizations, and the bulk of university research was funded directly by universities. So universities received money from the government, and they funded research with that by paying their staff and paying for facilities. During this time, performance-based funding accounted for a very small share of research income, and it was most commonly used in the medical and engineering sciences. So very few researchers in the arts or the humanities or the social sciences use the performance-based funding in the good or the bad old days, depending on one's perspective of it. The current situation is that performance-based funding has become much more common and has spread throughout the entire higher education and research system. So now it's also used in education. And I believe Vuokko will get into this in more detail in the Finnish case later on. But many public funded universities now routinely write contracts with the state which specifies, for instance, that they will receive funding for educating students based on their performance in terms of how many students they register and how many of these students complete. And these arrangements are usually signed for a specific number of years and then reviewed over time. So whereas initially performance-based funding was only directed as research, now we see that it's moving and colonizing nearly the entire higher education and research system. On an individual institutional level, research systems, national research systems differ radically in terms of what share of the research funding is performance-based, but generally it accounts for a larger share of research income even in publicly funded universities. So to give you an example, from where I am in Sweden, 60% or more of the total university budget for research is performance-based. And here it's important to understand that this money does not come directly to the university. It is money that researchers and research groups apply for as individuals or as research groups to different organizations, research councils, research foundations. And this sum is an average sum for the university as a whole. If you go to the medical and engineering faculties, it would be as much as 80% of the research is funded in this fashion. Institutional funding for research is also becoming more performance-based. So the share of block funding that goes directly to the university is also being subjected to performance-based criteria. So, for instance, the block grant could be directly linked to the institutions, the number of publications per university and other incomes such as indicators such as research income that are skewed for projects. Now, this when performance-based funding is directed at the university as a whole, at the institution as a whole, it's usually referred to as formula funding. And this approach we see applied here in Sweden. We see it applied in the Norwegian context and also in the Danish context, and of course in the UK. The internationalization of funding is, I would say, one of the most radical turns in performance-based funding in recent years. And that is funders coordinating calls across borders to promote specific types of research. So, for instance, you see the Joint Programming Initiative from the European Union, which is open in principle to researchers from all over the world, and and they are coordinated on a national level. But the idea is that they all receive money for a joint project at a specific point in time, and they conduct research together. Okay, so what is performance-based funding used for? Normally, we had performance-based funding being simply investigator-driven research projects. So basically, the idea of the autonomy of science was very much part of this equation, and research councils merely reviewed and granted or didn't grant projects that researchers themselves decided that what they wanted to do. But gradually, this focus still remains, but there is an attempt to try to use performance-based funding to steer research in much more concrete ways. So from bottom-up investigator-driven research projects, the funding landscape gradually changed to focusing on thematic calls, where a funder would decide that they would give money to researchers who were focusing on a particular issue. For instance, they were doing research on climate change or urban renewal or something like that. I'm sure you're all familiar with this kind of approach. This later evolved into more specific kinds of foci, such as funding for mobility, for instance, like the Marie Curie Sklodowska grants, which were very early in the funding of mobility on the European side. But before that, of course, the Americans had the Fulbright Fellowship. And now mobility performance-based funding is seen in many other settings across the world. We can use performance-based funding to promote new practices, for example, open science. One of the key developments in the European landscape is that any funding one receives from national or state research councils often comes with a requirement that all publications from the project open access, and that data in the project is based on the FAIR open data principle. Performance-based funding can also be used to promote specific types of research. For example, interdisciplinarity is one of the key sort of norms that comes with specific kinds of performance-based funding instruments. And the most popular and new and I would say all-consuming trend in performance-based funding is, of course, promoting new ways of organizing research. And this is the so-called excellence funding instrument, which started out with centers of excellence funding that was initially developed to promote resource concentration at the university level, and which evolved into excellence funding for individuals, supporting path-breaking or excellent research, as they like to call it. formula funding, institutional funding that is based on performance on preset indicators, for example, publication and funded research projects, jockeys into this excellence funding trend, in the sense that most of the excellence funding instruments are geared towards exploiting this particular approach to funding. So you have a cascading. On one hand, you have the university receiving funding based on these indicators like publication, and then on the other hand, you have the research group or the individual receiving funding because of excellence, and these two are tied in some cases, in that the ability of particular research groups and individuals to seek funding from particular research foundations may be tied to the institutional performance of their university. So in some grants, the university is allowed to apply, say, send 10 or 15 proposals to this particular funder based on their performance on the last 3 to 5 years as an organization as a whole on publication and funded research projects. While it is no longer discussed very much, project funding is still is the oldest and still most common way in which performance-based funding is used, and this is still directed at individual investigators, but it can also be directed at teams or at research environments, which is gradually becoming, as issues of research integrity become more and more in the forefront of university life. We see lots of funding being directed at research environments, either for making an environment excellent or at ensuring that a particular environment is created around a specific kind of research. So a team or several teams of researchers would be encouraged and to come together and build out a research agenda and recruit students and train postdocs in order to be able to create a resource concentration in a specific research area. As I mentioned, excellence funding is the biggest aspect of this, and it is also tied to the research environment idea, but it's also tied to, it can be on one case tied to individuals, like in the European Research Council individual grants, or it could be tied to universities as a whole. So for instance, France and Germany have implemented the excellence funding instrument and applied it to universities. So universities, whole institutions are deemed as excellent, and then they're given extra funding for disbursing in according to their own wishes, as opposed to giving the funding like the European Union does to one individual or to research groups, as in the case of centers of excellence. Last but not least, we have infrastructure funding, and research infrastructure and the associated staff with research infrastructure is also becoming a focus for performance-based funding, as databases and the need to meet fair data requirements become more integral to the whole issue of research integrity. Funding infrastructure is becoming a separate idea. I thought that maybe I can stop at this point and let Vuokko come in or take any immediate questions or clarification if there are any.
Thank you very much for a beautiful presentation, Merle. And now I pass the word to Vuokko, and we'll have the debate at the end.
Thank you very much, Anna-Maria. And yes, my name is Vuokko Kohtamaki, and I'm from the University of Tampere, as introduced early. And thank you for Merle for giving a very good background to performance-based funding. And my presentation will focus on Finnish higher education context to system level performance-based funding, and I call it by myself this whole environment as a performance governance ecology. And I will tell about performance agreements, what are applied in Finland, and they have been applied here almost 30 years now. It was 1994 when they first were launched. And then I will speak about the kind of performance-based funding applied in Finland. Now I need to go further, but let me see. Okay, from there. So this is the context of my presentation. I know I have too many slides, but we can skip some of the slides and focus on to those performance agreements and to this performance-based funding. And also I would like to share with you experiences from performance governance here in Finland and how university leaders respond to this type of performance governance, and also some experiences from academics. And then I will make some conclusions, Mark. I hope my time will be enough to do all this. So we have in Finland a higher education system that is fully public, but we have two types of higher education institutions. First, these universities, science institutions, and my presentation will be related to this sector. But we also have universities of applied sciences, and they have also performance-based funding nowadays, but it's different to universities. So here is some milestones from past 30 years. And until the end of 1980s, Finland, we can say that it was fully centralized state steering. We had line item funding, earmarked funding, strict regulations, and it was fully input steering. And it was also that if you like to establish an academic post, it must be in a state budget. So it was a very detailed regulation. And when we came to early 1990s, in that time there was an economic recession, and the unemployment rate, for example, was very high in Finland, and the whole public sector needed to reconsider how to make things more efficiently. And in that time was introduced management by objectives to the whole public sector, and universities in that time were part of the public sector. So in the case of university, it was setting targets, how many students will be taken in and how many students will be graduated, setting goals for those. And then in that same time, these ideas reflect pretty much new public management ideas. And the second or third, actually second milestone is launching these performance agreements. The idea was to modernize public sector governance, including universities. And in that time was introduced the first performance funding component to universities co-funding. We call it co-funding, the state fundings from the state budget to universities. But it was only 4%, but it was a very important beginning. And the whole formula, funding formula, was introduced. There were much more indicators. It was in 2003. And 2010, we had a university reform. It was not actually a funding reform, but financial autonomy reform. But after that, we got a new funding formula, and 75% is indicator-based. But I want to emphasize that we have performance agreement period. In the beginning, it was 3 years, and nowadays it's 4 years. And usually each performance period has its own funding model. So there are some new indicators or revised indicators somehow. So it was incremental changes after each performance agreement period. So this is a sort of, let's say, 30 years history of Milestones. And this is some what happened in this university reform. Perhaps the most important here is to say that nowadays universities are independent financially and legally. So they are public universities, or they can also operate as foundation universities. But both sectors, not sectors, but legal forms have exactly the same type of funding system, public funding system, and both have public mission. And from this slide, I can say that if we think the goals of university reform 2010, and if we think goals of performance-based governance and performance-based funding, it seems that they are pretty much the same goals. You can see the list here. It is improving performance of higher education institution and also enhancing the efficiency, economy, and effectiveness. Those three E's are in line with new public management. And of course, this is important to say that this competition and also to improve universities' capacity to compete nationally and also internationally. Okay, now we come to performance agreements. So each university makes it with the Ministry of Education. So nowadays it is for 4 years. And what is the purpose of these agreements? When they were introduced, it was modernizing higher education governance and leading back these earmarked funding systems and strict regulations. And this really changed the relationship between universities and the ministry. There are more interaction and meetings, face-to-face meetings, and the ministry also visits universities. And if I put it very shortly, what is the purpose? It is to specify what universities are expected to do in return to those public funding they receive from the state, and also set the time frames when certain activities must be done. And those national higher education policy goals are there behind, and also the Finnish government plan and ministry's higher education and research vision, and they have also nowadays roadmaps. So these all implements, including performance agreements, those national higher education policy goals. And as I mentioned, there's a certain protocol, how this process works. So there are some kind of, let's say, market mechanism. Universities make their offers, and then state make their counter offers, and there are negotiation, and then they sign finally the agreement. And during the agreement, there are midterm reviews, reporting, strict reporting systems, and measurement and evaluation, and universities get feedback. And as I mentioned, also those meetings. So there's certain protocol, and it demands quite a lot of work from university administrators to prepare these agreement templates and before this all is ready. And also it demands very much work from the ministry. And then some critical questions, not only related to Finnish context, but we can ask that to what extent those performance goals concern only research that are funded by state funding, using this co-funding. And what about goals that are funded by external funding bodies? Do performance agreement include those goals? In the Finnish case, the both questions, the answer is yes. And what about, does the plan require that you should also compete for private money? The answer is yes in the Finnish case. And then also, are there negative consequences if the goals are not achieved in a given time? And the answer is yes. Also in the Finnish case, if you do not achieve your targets and goals, it means that you will get less money. And let's take this, the last one. Does it determine access to funding? Yes, indeed, it does. So this all is related to our performance-based funding system, but these agreements define all activities, operations, what universities are expected to do and implement. And here you can see our funding formula. As you can see, 42 goes to education. They are education indicators, and this reflect to this performance agreement. Those performance agreements are education goal dominated. So most of those goals there are related to education. But of course, there are also research goals, but compared to amount of education-related goals, there are much less of research goals. They are related to the amount of external funding, and nowadays to international external funding. And I have circles, the red circles, what are the most important or highest weights there. So there are those bachelor and master degrees, scientific publications, and these external research funding. If you ask from Finnish researchers what are the most important indicators, I can guarantee that they will tell to you these indicators. And then there are those other indicators that are much, the weight is much smaller. They are, of course, important at the university level, but from the unit level perspective, these three are the most important. And then there's 25% related to higher education. Other policy goals, universities must compete of this money. And then these national duties mean that, for example, teacher education is divided between certain universities, and they will get funding from the ministry. So it's a long list of indicators. And does this give university stability? Somehow, yes. But if there are political pressures to change indicators or their weights, it is the mechanism, and it is typical that these are changed. Sometimes they are 3 or 4 years there, but it might be so that after 2 years, okay, we need more, for example, medical doctors somehow, and then this is a lever to give incentives to universities that they respond. So this is it's somehow also complicated system, but it's very transparent from the university's perspective, and it gives you somehow stability, but there's always uncertainty that they are not valid whole performance agreement. So changes can happen. So now I will go to these university responses to this performance governance. First of all universities have implemented certain changes, for example, to the internal management. There are new organizations and performance management system. It is emphasized there, and power-based hierarchies, and financial management is the focus. It's very important. And also the increasing role of individual leaders. And nowadays we have almost, I think that almost all universities have nowadays full-time deans. So they are somehow manager leaders. Early days they were more academic leaders, but they increasingly have tasks related to financial management. And of course, this performance management, it is internalized in universities pretty much. And universities' internal resource allocation models, we just got 1 year ago a report of this. So universities follow the state funding formula. Helsinki University is one exception that they have those history-based funding model, and it does not reflect so much the state funding formula. But all the other universities, we can say that they follow the formula. Of course, there are certain revisions, and it's not exactly the same, but pretty much they follow. And the performance agreement and these funding systems, they are used as internal management tools. And there are changes to human research policies, so there are increasingly recruitments from international labor market, international researchers who has good research networks and who are able to and have capacity to obtain external funding. And also university administrators in these past years, it seems that increasingly they are recruited from the private sector, for example, companies. And we have also, universities have started to apply tenure tracks models or modifications of them. And of course, this means that there are changes in internal cultures and practices. Measurement, result orientation, they are very important. And this collegial decision making, it's still there somehow, but not anymore so much than in early days. And of course, this means competition internally and externally. And if we think funding and this co-funding, basic funding, this formula, it's funding earning logic. So university deans say in this way that it's a funding earning logic, how you make your money and how you need to behave that you are able to get money using this formula. And it is the responsibility of mid-level leaders, and then they transfer this responsibility to individual academics, researchers. They have a key role in earning the money. And of course, this external funding, human research policies have changed, and universities seek partnerships with prestigious international universities, and also they boost university-company interaction, and they provide supporting services to researchers, and it's also promoting internationalization, prestige, and status. Let me see. And so it's somehow, we can say it's playing the performance games. So it's adapting to this game, and these key performance indicators, they are strong collective incentives. But for universities, it is balancing between this external and internal forces. You know this academic world internally, so it's not so, let's say, identical and do not always follow all trends. So there's some kind of balance seeking all the time. Here are experiences inside academia that does it, this performance management, increase efficiency. So in 2015, 22% agree, and around 4% agree. And then performance management, does it steer your work? So it's 20% agree and 5% disagree. But those who disagree, they are around 60% and 50%. So you can see these numbers. So there are agreements and disagreements related to this performance governance environment, but I think I need to go further. Here you can see the lines of external funding, and I have separated foundation universities. It's black line. No, it's lila. And the yellow one is public universities, and then there's the free best among public universities. So it seems that those foundation universities has done quite well. I don't know the specific reason for that, but when this foundation model was enabled, the idea was that they have better capacity to create stakeholder relationships to companies and so on. And this foundation status perhaps helped them, but I'm not sure whether it's so. But anyway, it seems that there are some differences, but it's also related to think that these foundation universities, they have these technical study fields. Here are some, I think I need to, you can see here research publication performance from OECD, Finland, and the world. So it seems that the Finnish numbers follow pretty much OECD average. And this is what we follow in Finland, that how we do in terms of other OECD countries and also in terms of other Nordic countries. So this performance-based governance brings this type of stimulus that you follow how you rank compared to other countries. So now I'm coming to my conclusion. So this performance governance, I would say that it is some kind of hybrid steering, and the core is in those national higher education policy goals, and those levers are these indicators, funding formula, these performance agreements and this interaction regulations. So there are various mechanisms, but all starts from those national education policy goals. And there's a centralized control aspect. This system drives system level performance, and universities are somehow the subsystems, and they are controlled how they perform against these goals that are set in these agreements. And these indicators, I don't know how they are so fascinating, but they easily go down to individual academics, that it's quite easy that people start to follow, because your money is dependent on your performance. But there are also side effects, that sometimes it stimulates overcommitment. So there's some kind of addiction to this performance, and also illusion of control, that when you follow this and you have these indicators that, okay, I know all of what is happening inside a university and everything is under control. But as we know, the real world does not work in this way. We don't know about the long-term evidence of this effectiveness. We know these short-term impacts, and there are indeed impacts, but what is the evidence in the long run? We cannot say about that. And what happens to financial autonomy? Somehow it strengthens that you can decide how you do these things, but it limits. You have these frames, you have this agreement, and you have the funding formula. So there are certain frames. And now I'm coming to my final slide here. So there are very strong pressures for individual academics to try to cope with these systems. And if you think your internal motivation, do you really have, how does it appear, and how much you behave based on those external incentives. And also there are changes of academic identities. There are effects to that. And also, if we think interaction here inside universities, so it is based on exchanges that as I explained, the system of purpose agreement. So you do those things that are written there, and you will get funding. So it works also internally, so that okay, if you do these things, you publish, then you are able to get the certain level of money. So it is based on exchanges. So altogether, these two, performance agreement and this performance-based funding, it's a kind of performance governance ecology, and it affects how universities interpret and recognize their resources and their resource environments, and how they financially behave. And it seems that there's missing something, but it seems that this type of systems, they standardize the work of universities, what we are doing here, because they so much follow these indicators in order to survive. So thank you very much. I don't know if I take over time, but here are some literature references. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Vuokko. It appears we will have a very good debate because we already have some questions. So I will start with a question to Merle from Pierre Ohio. So he asked how much in percentage for fundamental research, practice-oriented research, and programmatic research as a consequence of PBF.
We haven't seen any actual change in the direction of, you know, like in the proportion of what kind of research is being done. But I should say that this answer is very conditional on what kind of system you have. Sweden is a bit special in the sense that we do not have a large research institute sector like most other countries. So all research is done at the university in Sweden. So universities do applied research, they do basic research, and they also do like writing reports for the government, like what would be done in a research institute and other places. So a Swedish university functions like all of the public sector research performing organizations, but within one organization. So I think the only way to answer this question for Sweden would be to say what percentage of the actual funding for performance-based funding goes towards basic research as opposed to more applied and other kinds of research tasks. And I would say that we have about 60% of the funding that goes to investigator-driven projects, you know, projects that are not handed down from like a task. But that research may be all the way from curiosity-based or blue sky research to an applied task in medicine that a researcher herself may have decided needed to be done.
Okay. There's a question for Vuokko. In which extent the PBF model reinforces the Matthew effect in science, in addition to ensuring institutional stability?
Okay, thank you. This is a good question. And yes, indeed, if we think external funding, and I have looked at Finnish university, the share of external funding in past 10 years since the university reform was launched. And it seems that those universities that were successful in 29, they are now also successful. So the same universities, they are able to attract external funding. And those who has less funding, they have less funding also nowadays. So I think that there's a quite strong correlation, and I think it reflects exactly this Matthew effect. So if we look at this past 10 years, and so if you have money, the more money will come. Yeah. So that's my answer. Yes, indeed. The answer is yes, and I do have statistical evidence to that.
Yeah, it's the same in Sweden for the same 4 or 5 universities get about 60% of the total share of the funding available, and these institutions have not changed over the last 20 to 30 years. And it is the same with researchers, very much so that it is the people who perform well who continue to get money to perform. Particularly when the other kind of funding, the excellent funding, came into place. That's basically it just funds those who have already. So you have to be rich to continue to get money.
Okay. Now a question for both. In fact, 2 questions from Muriel Gavida, that's a professor here at Unicamp. So the first question is, how is the public mission, the public engagement, evaluated in your universities or in your higher education systems? And what is the importance of the public mission performance in the definition of funding?
Well, since 2007, I think it was, it was written into the Swedish higher education law that Swedish universities had to do public engagement or collaboration with non-academic actors. But we have never received any special funding. There is no funding stream attached to it. The idea is that that this third task or third mission should be accomplished via research and teaching. That it should be a natural byproduct of research and teaching. There have been attempts to create indicators and then to provide a third funding stream for this third task, but that has not emerged.
Okay, I can continue. This is also a very good question that comes now and then under policy discussion, and it was around 10 years ago we had we published a report related to this, that how third mission activities is measured in other countries, because we try to create indicators for that. And it seems that it's very complicated. In our current funding model, there are no indicators for that, this third mission activity. So these all are related to education activities or research activities. But our mission is also to enhance interaction with society. But we do not have any indicators for that. And of course, universities try to encourage researchers to do these third mission activities, for example, to cooperate with, let's say, foundations and agencies, different types of agencies. But researchers are not motivated to do that because you will not get funding for that. And that report that was published, let's say it specified a list of third mission activities and how to interact with wider public audience, but then how to translate it to indicators. So there was no solution for that. And I have to say that this formula is not successful from that perspective. But it's officially part of the mission of universities. And I think it's the same in Sweden, that you are expected to interact with society. Yes,
but not paid for it.
Yeah.
I think we have the same challenge here in Brazil, and we do not have any kind of any type of performance-based funding. There is a question to Vuokko, and a question to both. So does that form of evaluation, the PBF, consider the characteristics of each higher education institution? And a question to both. What do you think of using alternative indicators like arithmetics in addition to more traditional ones as criteria for PBF?
Do I start with this?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Indeed, this is I mentioned in my presentation that this performance governance, it tends to standardize the work of universities. And now this question is that how does it take into account specific characters of each university? I would say that this is related to profiling, because there is expectations that universities will profile themselves. That, for example, my university here, the Tampere University, it is social sciences and then technology, and also this social sciences, or society, not social, but society, technology, and the third is medical sciences. And this is, I think that this is a way to take into account the characteristics of the specific university. But it's quite hard to profile if you have this type of funding system that is exactly the same for all. And you need to find external funding to profile yourself if you really like to, for example, enhance certain disciplines at your university. So you need to do it by yourself, but this funding system do not pay attention to that. That would be my answer. That profiling is a method to take into account somehow these characters.
So Merle, do you want to extend your comments?
I think that in our case, none of the indicators take into consideration any special characteristics of the universities. It has actually been a lot of discussion about this, and what this has actually been an issue that has come from the critical side, that the universities that are younger and more diverse and less traditional have argued that the model for performance-based funding is on the surface fair, but nevertheless it still gives a great advantage to those institutions that already existed, and it doesn't create any opportunities for taking into consideration the different contexts, different student populations, etc., that other institutions have, in spite of the fact that it remunerates everybody for the same things. So taking into consideration the special characteristics of the university is I think very difficult to do. So for most governments, they would like to have a model that of compensation or remuneration that is comparable across institutions, rather than allows institutions to claim some sort of exceptional status. Because if it's public money, there has to be also fairness in terms of what is compensated and how compensation occurs. So it's difficult to talk about making arguments for being compensated or building models based on special characteristics, because even those characteristics would have to be turned into indicators that would have to be available or accessible to any institution that wants to claim that they should be remunerated for that characteristic. It can't be attached to a particular institution. So these models generally stay away from these kinds of exotic elements, like taking special characteristics into consideration.
Okay. There is a question about the evaluation studies of the PBFs, comparing higher education systems that use and not use this model. and what are the main results, I would like to extend this question because Vuokko has a text from 2016 that is about impact evaluation of PBF. And in that moment, the conclusion were that there was few studies of impact evaluation, and the impact were small, or the studies did not found any impact, and also highlighted the need to evaluate the type 2 of PBF that are the large share of budget linked to PBF. So I'd like to ask to Vuokko and also to Merle if you think that the scenario changed, that there is more impact evaluation of the impacts of PBF model.
The thing here is that we do, for example, in Europe, and also in the context of United States, those studies mostly are case studies, and they have not applied any big surveys, and I think that we should have big surveys, but the problem is that if you make a cross-country study, so there are those contextual differences, they are usually quite big, and then you should have enough long time, let's say 10 years, 15 years, or 20 years. But it also means that if you try to make that kind of long-term study, the funding formula should be the same in order to follow its impacts. But as in the case in Finland, I think it's also in other countries, it's all the time somehow revised. It is not stable. If you have 10 years, it's different. 10 years ago it was different what is today, and if we think further 10 years, it will be different. So it means that to test and create circumstances for that, there should be certain elements that would be stable, and it's impossible to create this type of circumstances. I hope I'm explaining this in understandable way. And but I don't know studies where has been compared PBF and system that do not at all apply PBF. That might be interesting, that if you apply traditional funding model, and what would be your difference compared to these PBF systems. I don't know studies like that. And this what was published 2016. After that, there might be new research, but I haven't followed now that. But
I haven't seen anything like that.
Yeah.
No. In fact, the system, it may be possible to then the only thing is, I think it's hard to find a system like this in Europe. But I guess we could compare a European system with a non-European. That might be an interesting way to go, if one could find that sample. I don't know if there is any higher education system that doesn't have performance-based funding. It may have some, there must be some, there usually is some small, it may not be as, it may not be as, so getting this wild sample is the problem, but it would be an interesting thing to try to look for.
I agree. I fully agree.
what you have is a lot of studies on the impact of evaluation on the system, and that's in the European context. Those studies are very much dominated by studies of the British system and the research, the research, the REF and the RAE systems. Australia has got also the same. But what is going on in Brazil? Do you have any performance-based funding, or because you said you didn't? I think I heard you say you didn't, Anna Maria.
No, we do not have any type of PBF model here. Only the state state universities in São Paulo has financial autonomy, so the budget of the federal system, that is the national universities, are defined by the Minister of Education, but it's not in this type of model that you have to follow some indicators or any type of agreements on the budget and on the funding.
So maybe Brazil might be a place that we could use. Brazil might be our comparative.
Yeah, maybe the public system could be a way to a comparison group.
Yeah, this might not be bad, but Brazil does have these CAPE scholarships. The ones that you rolled out, education without borders or whatever. I remember. There was a point when everybody was, every university in Europe was gearing up to get those scholarships. And they, somebody, Anna Maria and Adriana has said that.
Adriana is remember that maybe the allocation of scholarship from CAPS is a kind of PBF. Because they allocate scholarship considering the performance of the graduate programs. But it's only one part for one activity of the university. It's not the whole budget of the university. Is one part, and it's a very small part of our budget. Yes.
Well, it sounds like we might have a case here, Vuokko.
Yeah,
we would certainly be interested in coming to Brazil to investigate this further.
Yeah, you are. Since now you are invited to come in. We can think and study to compare the system. It would be very interesting.
And also those experiences from academics. That would be interesting. Very interesting to compare.
Yeah, exactly. How do you how do people respond? Are they more relaxed, or are they just as stressed as the rest of us who are being hit on the head with a hammer every day? Or
I think it would be riots here if someone decided to create PBF. But it's a good thing to think. So we do not say welcome.
I was thinking that because Finland has so strong this PBF, and based on this experience, if I would give a recommendation to another country, I would not nominate any country, but some country that is planning this PBF, I would recommend that there is some basic funding. And then above that, you will have a performance-based element, and then perhaps some innovations, strategic funding based on yearly based consideration, but some basic funding that you can be sure that you will at least get that level of money. And above that, some part of PBF. That would be my recommendation.
Yeah. The problem is that once it usually starts like that, and then the politicians get the idea that the performance-based funding is so much better at steering and getting what they want than the other part, that they start whittling away at the basic at the basic part, and it gets smaller and smaller every year.
Yes, yes, because of the budget pressures. That's true. Yeah.
So we do not have more questions. So I would, if you want to take some minutes to make some final remarks, we have some time already. So,
well, Merle? I just want to say, I just thought that first I'd like to thank Vinny for the suggestion, for inviting me. It's been a very interesting experience. I've also had not thought about this before, but during this presentation, I thought that there were obviously quite a lot of things going on with your work, Vuokko, that is very close to what I do, and we are very, very close geographically. So
yes.
perhaps we should try to do something together. After this, I think that might be a good idea, because of there's a lot of stuff that I think we have in common in terms of what we do. So this is an unexpected benefit from me. Yeah. And I hope that we will get to be able to do much more collaboration with GEOPI in the future as well. We may not get to come to Brazil, but at least we could do research with Brazil.
Yes, thank you, Merle. Vuokko.
Yes, thank you so much. I also warmly like to thank you. I was so excited to attend this seminar and continue somehow our early connection from 2016. So this was really nice, and the topic was excellent too. And also, this is a good way to network, and it would be really nice to see all of you. And of course, Merle, you are so close to Finland. Hope we can somehow cooperate. And there's a good flight connection from Stockholm to Tampere. So you're welcome to visit here, and also our Brazilian colleagues.
Thank you both. We are very happy to have you both here today. And I think we have a wonderful webinar, and we are very happy to make the connection between you two, and also to open this opportunity for further research in this team that is so important about funding, and also the governance of higher education. So thank you both. And I would like also to say that we have the next webinar will be on June 3rd, and will be about the ways of evaluate impact of the research beyond academia. So thinking the other impacts beside publication, citation, and all the traditional indicators. So it's very related with this webinar. So we wait you all on June 3rd on this same time. So thank you, and bye-bye.